The conversation felt normal. That's what made it dangerous. Ethan stood near the coffee station, listening casually as a colleague responded to a suggestion. "Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense," the man said quickly, nodding with a smooth confidence that felt almost rehearsed. "I was thinking the exact same thing." Ethan gave a small nod back, but something didn't settle right. The words were correct, the tone was agreeable, the response on the surface was perfect. Too perfect. There was no pause, no consideration, no natural hesitation that usually exists when people process someone else's idea. It was immediate, clean, aligned. And that's what triggered it. A subtle signal in Ethan's mind. Not loud, not obvious, just a quiet sense that something didn't match. He didn't react, didn't question it, but the feeling stayed, because this wasn't the first time, and now he was starting to notice it. He walked back to his desk, the conversation replaying in fragments, the speed of the response, the smoothness of the agreement, the lack of friction. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't real either. And that's when the thought surfaced. What if manipulation doesn't feel like pressure? What if it feels like agreement? Ethan sat down slowly, eyes on the screen but attention elsewhere, because something had changed in him. He wasn't just observing behavior anymore. He was sensing inconsistencies, tiny ones, almost invisible, the kind most people ignore, but once you notice them, they start appearing everywhere. Over the next few hours, Ethan found himself watching conversations differently. Not what people said, but how they said it, the timing, the transitions, the alignment between expression and emotion. And patterns started forming. Some people spoke with natural variation, small pauses, slight imperfections. Their tone shifted depending on what they felt. Their words didn't always come out perfectly structured, human. But others were clean. Too clean. Responses came quickly, emotion felt controlled, tone remained consistent, and that consistency felt artificial. Ethan leaned back slightly, connecting it. Normal behavior has noise. Controlled behavior removes it. That's the difference, because real interaction isn't perfect. It's messy, unpredictable, slightly inefficient, but manipulation is optimized. That realization settled deeper than expected because it changed something fundamental. It meant that manipulation wasn't about obvious control. It was about subtle design. And design leaves patterns. Ethan's mind sharpened around that idea because patterns can be studied, and anything that can be studied can be detected. Later that day, during a team discussion, Ethan tested something. He stopped focusing on the content and started focusing on alignment. One person was explaining an idea, but their tone carried more certainty than the situation justified. Another agreed quickly, but their expression didn't match the enthusiasm in their voice. Mismatch. That's the word. It clicked instantly. Manipulation isn't in what people say, it's in what doesn't match. Words and tone, emotion and timing, expression and intent. When those things align naturally, the interaction feels real. When they don't, something feels off, even if you can't explain why. Ethan felt a quiet shift inside him, because now that uncomfortable feeling from earlier made sense. It wasn't random, it was detection. The brain noticing inconsistencies before the conscious mind catches up. He looked across the room. Daniel was there. Same calm presence, same controlled behavior. But now, Ethan saw it differently. Daniel didn't have mismatches. Everything aligned perfectly. And that raised a deeper question. Is perfect alignment real, or is it the highest form of control? That thought lingered longer than expected because it introduced something uncomfortable. Maybe manipulation isn't about mistakes. Maybe it's about precision. Ethan exhaled slowly, because this wasn't just about others anymore. It was about understanding a system, one that operates beneath normal interaction. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. He returned to his screen, but his awareness didn't turn off. Every conversation now carried layers, visible and hidden. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't just part of the interaction. He was outside it, watching, analyzing, detecting. And that's where everything changes. Because the moment you stop reacting and start observing, you begin to see the structure behind behavior. And once the structure becomes visible, manipulation loses its invisibility. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes predictable. And predictability is the first step to control. Ethan leaned back again, eyes steady now, not confused, not uncertain, just aware.
Because now he understood something most people never do. Manipulation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look aggressive. It doesn't feel forced. It blends in. It aligns. It feels natural. But beneath that natural feeling, there is design, and design can always be traced. That realization settled quietly, cold, clear, unavoidable. And somewhere across the room, Daniel continued working, calm as always, unchanged. But this time, Ethan wasn't trying to figure him out. He was studying the system behind him. Because now he knew the real power isn't in controlling people, it's in understanding the patterns they can't hide. And once you see those patterns, you're no longer part of the illusion. You're outside it, watching it, and slowly learning how to break it. Ethan didn't need proof anymore. He needed patterns. And once his mind locked on to mismatch, everything started revealing itself faster than he expected. The next time it happened, it was almost obvious. A colleague leaned toward him during a discussion, nodding quickly, almost too quickly. "Exactly," he said. "That's exactly what I was thinking. We're on the same page." The words were supportive, the tone was aligned, but the timing was wrong. There was no processing delay, no evaluation, no natural friction that comes when two people independently arrived at the same conclusion. It was immediate alignment, over-alignment. Ethan leaned back slightly, letting the conversation continue, but his attention stayed locked on that moment. Why remove all resistance unless resistance is a problem for you? That question stayed, because resistance is natural, it's part of real interaction, and when it disappears completely, something else is controlling the exchange. Later that afternoon, Daniel noticed a different pattern. This time, it wasn't agreement, it was pressure. A discussion around deadlines had started to tighten. Nothing dramatic, just the usual workplace urgency building slowly. Then someone spoke. "We really need to finalize this today, otherwise we risk delaying everything." The words weren't wrong, but the effect was immediate. Energy shifted, people straightened, responses became faster, a slight tension entered the room. Ethan felt it too, that internal push, the subtle pressure to act quickly, to decide, to move. And that's when he saw it clearly. This isn't urgency. This is induced urgency. Because real urgency comes from situation. Artificial urgency comes from language. It's introduced, injected to bypass thinking. Because when people feel pressure, they don't analyze, they react. Ethan slowed down intentionally, did nothing, said nothing, and something interesting happened. The pressure didn't hold. It weakened because it needed participation. It needed people to accept it. Without that, it had no structure. Ethan felt a quiet realization settle in. Manipulation needs reaction to survive. Without reaction, it collapses. That changed everything. Because now, instead of trying to resist manipulation, he could simply not engage with it, not emotionally, not automatically, just observe. And observation alone started breaking its effect. But the deeper layer revealed itself soon after, in conversation, in questions, simple ones, casual, almost forgettable. "So how's your workload been lately? Still handling the same accounts?" someone asked, tone light, conversational. Ethan answered briefly, "Normal, nothing unusual." But later, in a different discussion, those same details came back, used, positioned, framed. "Since you're already managing those accounts," the same person said, "it makes sense for you to take this on as well." Clean logic, reasonable, hard to argue, but now he saw it. That wasn't a question, that was data collection, information gathered earlier, now being used to shape outcome. That's when the pattern became undeniable. Not all questions are for connection, some are for mapping, understanding capacity, understanding behavior, understanding limits. And once someone understands those things, they don't need to force decisions, they guide them. Ethan felt a slight tension in his chest, not fear, awareness, because this changed the nature of conversation completely. Every question now had potential, every answer had consequence, and suddenly, interaction didn't feel casual anymore. It felt structured, designed. Ethan sat back, his eyes scanning the office slowly, because now it wasn't just one person, it was everywhere. Different levels, different styles.
But the same underlying mechanics. Agreement used to build trust. Pressure used to force decisions. Questions used to collect leverage. And most people moved through it unconsciously, responding, reacting, participating without ever seeing the structure. Ethan exhaled slowly, because now the awareness had reached a new level. It wasn't occasional anymore, it was constant. And that came with a cost, because once you start seeing manipulation patterns, conversations lose their simplicity. Nothing feels completely natural. Everything carries possibility, intent, design. Ethan looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up, because this was the uncomfortable truth. The more you see, the less you can ignore. But at the same time, the less control others have over you. And that balance was just beginning. The awareness didn't slow down, it expanded. What started as a few subtle inconsistencies was now everywhere. Conversations that once felt simple now felt layered. Words carried intent, tone carried direction, timing carried purpose. Ethan sat in a meeting, listening, but not participating the same way anymore. He wasn't following the discussion, he was scanning it, watching how ideas were introduced, how people reacted, how energy shifted based on phrasing, not logic. And that's when he saw it. Not manipulation through pressure, not through agreement, but through something far more subtle: framing. A colleague presented an idea, but not directly. He didn't say what should be done. He changed how the situation was viewed. If we look at this as a long-term investment, then the short-term cost shouldn't be the main concern. The sentence wasn't forceful. It wasn't even a clear argument, but it did something powerful. It changed the lens. And once the lens changed, the decision changed with it. People started responding differently. Less resistance, more acceptance, different priorities. Ethan felt it happen in real time, and that's when it clicked. He didn't change the decision, he changed how the decision is seen. That's the core of manipulation. Not controlling choices directly, but controlling the context around them. Because once context is controlled, choices become predictable. Ethan leaned back slightly, letting the discussion continue. Because now he wasn't just detecting patterns, he was understanding mechanisms. And mechanisms can be broken. That realization created a shift from passive awareness to active testing. Later that day, the opportunity came. Another conversation, another subtle push. "We really should finalize this today," someone said again,
tone carrying that same artificial urgency. Ethan felt it instantly. The pressure, the expectation, the push toward quick agreement. But this time, he didn't absorb it. He paused just long enough, then asked, "Is there a reason it has to be today?" The question was simple, neutral, but it did something critical. It broke the frame. Because urgency only works when accepted. When questioned, it weakens. The person hesitated slightly. Not exactly, but it would be better. The pressure dropped immediately, and the room adjusted. Slower responses, more consideration, less emotional push. Ethan felt it clearly. You don't fight manipulation, you disrupt its structure. That was the turning point, because for the first time, he wasn't just seeing it, he was breaking it. And it didn't require aggression or confrontation, just clarity, just questions. That's all it took. The next pattern revealed itself even more subtly. Time pressure. Not real deadlines, perceived ones. "Let's just decide now," someone said in another discussion. "We don't need to overthink this." It sounded reasonable, efficient, even logical. But now Ethan saw through it. This isn't efficiency, this is speed without analysis. Because when decisions are rushed, control shifts to whoever frames the situation first. Ethan didn't respond immediately, didn't agree, didn't disagree. He just slowed it down. "Let's take a minute just to make sure we're not missing anything." No resistance, no challenge, just delay. And that delay restored thinking. That's the key. Manipulation thrives in speed. Clarity exists in pause. Ethan felt the difference instantly, because now he wasn't being pulled into decisions, he was controlling the pace of them. And pace is power. That's when everything began to settle. Not disappear, but organize. The overwhelm from earlier started turning into structure. Patterns weren't random anymore. They were predictable. Over-agreement builds trust quickly. Urgency removes thinking. Questions collect leverage. Framing shapes decisions. All connected, all systematic.
Ethan sat quietly, letting that structure lock into place. Because now, he didn't need to analyze everything actively. He could feel it, instantly. Not emotionally, but cognitively. Like recognizing a pattern you've seen too many times. And once that happens, reaction disappears. Only awareness remains. He looked across the office. Daniel was there. Same calm presence, same controlled behavior. But this time, Ethan wasn't comparing himself. He wasn't trying to understand him. He was operating within the same system, seeing what Daniel sees, recognizing what others miss. And that changed something fundamental. Because the moment you stop reacting automatically and start seeing structure, you step outside the influence. And once you're outside it, you're no longer easy to control. The patterns didn't stop, they refined. What once felt complex now started feeling predictable, not because the behavior changed, but because Ethan's perception had sharpened enough to see through it instantly. The next layer revealed itself through something even more subtle, not lies, but incomplete truth. During a project discussion, someone presented an update. The numbers were accurate, the progress was real, nothing was technically wrong, but something felt selective. Ethan listened carefully. What was said made sense, but what wasn't said changed the meaning entirely. Key constraints were missing, risks weren't mentioned, limitations were quietly ignored, and because of that, the situation appeared more stable than it actually was. That's when it became clear. Manipulation doesn't require false information. It only requires incomplete information. Because people don't question what they don't see. They respond to what's presented. And if the presentation is controlled, the conclusion becomes controlled too.
Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't challenge directly. He just asked, "What would change if this doesn't go as expected?" The room paused, not because the question was complex, but because it introduced something that wasn't in the frame: uncertainty. The speaker hesitated briefly, then started adding details, missing pieces, risks that weren't mentioned before. And just like that, the perception shifted. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but enough. Ethan felt it. You don't expose manipulation by attacking it. You expose it by completing what's missing. That realization settled deeply because it gave him control without conflict. But the next pattern was even hiddener. It didn't involve words, it involved behavior, subtle mirroring. Ethan noticed it during a casual interaction. Someone adjusted their tone to match his, used similar phrasing, even matched his pacing. At first, it felt natural, comfortable, like alignment. But now, it felt intentional, because the similarity wasn't random, it was too precise, too consistent. That's when Ethan understood. This isn't connection, this is synchronization. Because when someone mirrors you, your brain interprets it as familiarity, trust, comfort, without conscious awareness, and that lowers resistance, makes you more open, more agreeable, more influenceable. Ethan tested it. He shifted his tone slightly, changed his pacing, and within seconds, the other person adjusted too, automatically. That confirmed it. Not coincidence, design. Ethan remained calm, but internally, everything sharpened. Because now he wasn't just detecting behavior, he was seeing adaptation in real time, and that level of awareness changed interaction completely. But the deepest layer revealed itself in something even more psychological: guilt. Not direct, not obvious, subtle, framed inside normal conversation. "I thought you'd be the kind of person who'd support this," someone said lightly during a discussion. The words sounded casual, but the implication wasn't. It introduced pressure, not logical pressure, emotional pressure. Because now the decision wasn't just about the task, it was about identity. If you don't agree, what does that say about you? That's the mechanism. Guilt doesn't force decisions, it reframes them, from logical choice to personal reflection, and that's where control happens. Ethan felt it, that internal pull, the instinct to respond, to align, to maintain perception. But this time, he didn't. He paused, let the statement exist without reacting, then said calmly, "Let's focus on the outcome, not assumptions." Neutral, detached, and instantly the emotional pressure dissolved. Because guilt only works when accepted. Without acceptance, it has no effect. Ethan exhaled slowly, because now everything had connected. The patterns weren't separate anymore. They were part of the same system. Selective truth controls perception. Mirroring builds trust. Guilt creates emotional pressure, all leading to the same outcome: influence. But now, that influence wasn't invisible anymore. It was structured, predictable, detectable.
Ethan sat still for a moment, letting it all settle, because something had changed. Not just awareness, not just understanding, control. Not over others, but over himself, his reactions, his responses, his decisions. And that's where real freedom begins. Because once you stop reacting automatically, no one can guide your behavior without your awareness. Ethan looked across the office again. Same environment, same people, same conversations. But now, it felt transparent, like watching a system operate from the outside. And for the first time, there was no confusion, no hesitation, no emotional pull, just clarity. Cold, precise, complete. The test didn't feel dramatic. That's what made it real.
It happened in a meeting that looked completely routine. No visible tension, no obvious conflict, just a discussion about task allocation and deadlines. But underneath, the structure was already forming. Ethan could feel it before anything was said. Because now, he wasn't listening to words, he was watching intent. A colleague leaned slightly forward, tone calm, but carefully structured. "Given your experience with similar projects," he said, looking directly at Ethan, "it would probably make the most sense for you to take this on." It sounded reasonable, logical, even flattering, but Ethan didn't respond immediately, because the pattern was clear. Over-alignment from earlier conversations, information collected previously, now being used as justification, and layered on top of that, subtle pressure, expectation disguised as logic. Ethan felt the structure instantly, not emotionally, mechanically. This isn't a request, this is a positioned outcome. He stayed still, let the silence exist, because silence now was no longer uncomfortable. It was space, space to think, space to break patterns. Then he spoke. "What's the priority behind assigning it this way?" he asked calmly. The question shifted everything, because it didn't accept the frame, it examined it. The colleague paused, just for a second, but that second was enough, because now the structure had been interrupted. "Well, it's just about efficiency," he replied. Ethan nodded slightly. "Then let's align based on capacity, not past experience," he said. Simple, neutral, but precise. The pressure disappeared because the logic had been redirected, not rejected. That's the difference. You don't fight manipulation, you replace its structure. The conversation moved on quickly. No tension, no conflict, but the outcome had changed. Ethan leaned back slightly, observing, because this wasn't about winning, it was about control. Control of perception, control of direction, control of response. And for the first time, he had it. Not partially, completely. Across the room, Daniel was there, watching. Same calm presence, same unreadable expression. But this time, there was no gap, no difference in understanding. Because Ethan wasn't reacting anymore. He was operating. Inside the same system, seeing the same patterns, breaking the same structures. That's when it became clear. The final realization. Not about others, about himself. Manipulation only works when you're unaware of the pattern. The moment you see it, it loses its power. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes predictable. And predictable things can't control you. Ethan stood up slowly after the meeting ended. The office looked the same. Nothing had changed on the surface. People still talking, still working, still interacting. But underneath, everything felt different, transparent. Every conversation now had structure. Every interaction had layers. And for the first time, Ethan could see all of them, clearly, without effort. He walked past a group discussing something casually, noticed the tone shifts, the subtle alignment, the micro adjustments in behavior, patterns, everywhere, predictable, understandable, breakable. He stopped near his desk, placing his hand lightly on the table, still, grounded, not overwhelmed anymore, because the awareness had stabilized, turned into clarity, turned into control. Daniel walked past him, same as always, calm, controlled, silent. For a brief moment, their eyes met. No acknowledgement, no signal, but something had changed. Before, Ethan was trying to understand the system. Now, he was part of it, not as a participant, but as someone who sees through it. And that changes everything. Ethan looked away first, not because he had to, but because he didn't need to keep observing. The system was already clear. Final line. The moment you see the pattern, the control disappears, and the game becomes yours. If this made you see something you couldn't see before, subscribe, because most people never notice the patterns that are controlling them.